Well, good evening, everybody. Good to be back in Tullamore. I'm tempted to move now closer to you, but apparently I have to stay within reach of this. Given what has just been, you might think I'm here on false pretenses when you look at the title of the lecture, because I'm going to be talking about the Dowris hoard. And as most of you probably know, the Dowris hoard is found at Lough Owel, which is just outside Birr. And Birr is a very long way from the Brosna. But the book, in fact, it's not just about the linear river that rises north of Lough Owel and flows into the Shannon. It's largely about its catchment. And Wigsborough, where the Dowris hoard was found, is on the edge of the catchment a little bit north of Birr. In fact, I didn't start out to write a book on Brosna at all. What I started to write about was, I realised, a lot of people had mentioned it over the years, that there's nothing substantial written about the story of Lough Boora, particularly the Mesolithic story of Lough Boora, in any kind of detail. You know, all you can pick up are just the odd leaflet and so on. So I set out to write maybe a pamphlet or a booklet on that subject, but I hadn't got very far without realising that you can't tell this story about what Lough Boora and the Mesolithic in Lough Boora really means without looking at the story of the catchment, the broader catchment of what was happening today. So that's why I had to be careful with the title. You know, it's about the landscape of the Brosna as much as it is about the actual river and the things that pertain strictly to the modern river. What you mightn't realise is the Brosna is not. It's not a textbook river, you know, in the sense that the textbook river, if you're a geography student, rises in the mountains and then flows rapidly down the hill, etc., before entering a middle stretch where it's picking up speed and joining other streams, etc., before sluggishly flowing eventually into the sea. But the Brosna, the Brosna started out. I don't know how that got up on its side, but it doesn't matter. The Brosna actually started out as a lake. This is a map made a couple of years ago, attempting to show, to give you some kind of bearings. This is Slieve Bloom here, right? This is about 10,000 years ago, showing you that at the end of the Ice Age, what you had stretching right across the Midlands, and the boundaries of it here, this isn't the end of it, it's just that they haven't mapped it further north. Main point to show here is that we now realise that at the end of the Ice Age, you had a vast lake, which geologists retrospectively called Glacial Lough Boora. And it was only, we think, maybe 9,000 years ago, when that lake eventually managed to breach the Eskers at Ferbane, that this vast lake was partially drained, resulting in a network of smaller lakes, large and small, which eventually became the templates on which the bogs formed. Okay? And the Brosna, the modern River Brosna, basically incised itself on that lake landscape. So, in other words, it's quite different in terms of how it started out, etc., from what you might consider to be more typical rivers. So, to focus on how that relates then to the Dowris hoard, Lough Owel. This is Lough Owel. And Birr is just off the map down here. We enlarge on it a little more. This is part of the 1838 Ordnance Survey, the first edition of the Ordnance Survey map. And you can see at the time, a substantial lake, very deep, 40, 50 metres apparently by all accounts at the time. And north of it, it's right on the southern edge of, what eventually became known as Lough Boora complex of peatlands. So all the way from here up to the modern River Brosna, more or less, is a vast, extensive area of peatlands. So that's Lough Owel, and this is the place where the Dowris hoard was found. Now, this is the 1909 second edition map, and you can see that by 1909, as a result of drainage, largely, the lake had more or less disappeared. Can you see that faint blue line there? Mm-hmm. That's the original Lough Boora of the first map superimposed on the 1909 map. So you can see gradually, as time went by, it's disappearing. There it is, slightly enlarged. There's no substantial body of open water anymore. But I will draw your attention because it becomes an important part of the story later on. Can you see here there? 1, 2, 3. There's a little chaplet of 4 small lakes there. Yeah? Can you see them? 1, 2, 3, 4, of which the uppermost one is known locally as Black Lough. Now, come back. That is a very important part of telling the story. Come back to it later on. But just to put you in the picture for the moment. That was 1909. By the time botanists started to pay attention in the 1930s, all that remained of the lake was what was described as a limey marsh. And if you visit it today, this is what you will find. In other words, it's been planted with conifers or has spontaneously become recolonized with birds, etc. In other words, this extraordinary, when you learn what the story is, this extraordinary landscape basically has essentially disappeared. There's no way to get into it. There's no signpost to tell you why it's important or what is found here, etc. Maybe in the course of time that can be reversed, but this is what you have today. Anyway, to start off then, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the story of the Dowris hoard or who have forgotten it, let me just briefly tell the story first of all, as it is normally told. We'll go back to there's a map. This map is about 1800, 1801, that sort of time. And there's Figsborough, and there's Lough Boora at the time. You can see it's surrounded on all sides by bogs, which are more or less intact, virgin bog on all sides. So there's Lough Boora. In the early 1820s, two men were trenching potatoes on the edge of what had been Lough Boora when they unearthed a vast quantity of ornaments of bronze, hundreds of objects of all sorts, which eventually came into the hands both of the great local historian Thomas Lough Owel and of the River Brosna. About 200 objects, more or less up 50-50 between Lough Brosna and Cook. But the strange thing is that's what was found. I'll talk about the individual objects in a moment. You can see you've got socketed axes here, you've got lots of spearheads, you've got these strange objects here, battered-looking old cauldron, and they were obviously musical instruments or trumpets. But the extraordinary thing about it, well, the first extraordinary thing about it, is that even though the Dowris hoard was unearthed in the early 1820s, it only came to the attention of the outside world, in the late or mid to late 1830s. It's extraordinary. If you look at Thomas Cook's History of Parsonstown, which is published in 1827, there's no mention of it. And more extraordinary still, the antiquarians of the Ordnance Survey in the late 1830s make no mention of it. So it was kept secret, kept silent. Nobody knew anything. But the first brief note mentioning this extraordinary find was in 1833. But the first detailed account only occurs by Dr. Anderson in 1848. And in his account, published in 1848, of the Dowris hoard, he has one sentence which is very significant. He said that he's remarking on the absence of gold. Everything in the Dowris hoard is bronze. He's remarking the absence of gold, and he's wondering if, in fact, there had been ornaments of gold when it was originally found, and that they had mysteriously disappeared over a period of almost 20 years. And he says in his account that this is due to what he calls, and I quote, that strange suspiciousness that is such a peculiar feature of the Irish peasant. In other words, he's putting his finger on the pulse in a sense. In other words, these lads who found this enormous cache of stuff and managed to hide it. I mean, where did they hide it even. You know, that wouldn't be easy to find. I mean, it filled an entire cartload, all this massive object. And then a lot may well have happened in that intervening 20 years. In other words, there may well have been other objects, etc. We have to be very careful about what we believe, about what was being said, particularly by people locally, where it was found, when it was found, etc., etc. There's a big question mark that still remains over it. That's the sort of museum selection of the objects. They're more impressive in a sense when they're. This was from an exhibition in Belfast, I think, about 20, 30 years ago. It gives you a better sense of the enormity of some of the objects, particularly of the trumpets. They're huge things. And the enigmatic nature of some of the other ones. There were only 5 swords found in it, that the best preserved, about 43 spears, of which this is just a selection. I mean, in other words, lots and lots of them. These are drawings that were made shortly after the hoard came to public attention, giving you a better sense of, you know, what they looked like structurally. And about 43 socketed axes. Again, it looks repetitive when I run them up, but they're all different. It's a huge collection of them. 44 spears, 43 of these socketed axes, a battered bronze cauldron, and several battered buckets, which would strike us as being the least interesting objects in the Dowris. But in fact, to archaeologists, they are among the most significant because they enable them to pin down continental connections. In other words, continental influences on how they were made, the design of them, etc., etc., etc. That's the base of one of the buckets, which is repaired endlessly, showing that these were considered to be valuable. And there again, the five swords. And then we come to these horns or trumpets, of which 23 were found. At least 23 survived from what we know of the Dowris hoard. And they're clearly musical instruments, you can see from them. But how were they played? Because they don't have reeds. They don't have reeds. They have these holes at the top. But every attempt, or nearly every attempt, at playing them, failed. And one particularly interesting example of such a failure was a Dr. Robert Ball, convinced they're musical instruments. And he succeeded in producing a deep bass note resembling the bellowing of a bull. But his attempts to improve on this were disastrous because, and I quote, "It is a melancholy fact that the loss of this gentleman's life was occasioned by a subsequent experiment of the same kind. In the act of attempting to produce a distinct sound on a large trumpet, he burst a blood vessel and died a few days later," without proving the point. But in fact, I think it's about, must be 30 years ago now, a young musician called Simon O'Dwyer, the penny dropped with him. He realised that they were playing, like, for example, Australian Aboriginal didgeridoos. It requires a double breathing technique in order to get the sound from them. And when they are played, they have an effect that really does make the hair at the back of your head stand on end. It's such a strange sound. And Simon now, with his ancient music band, in fact, he makes a living playing these instruments in combination with modern instruments as well. But it makes the point that he proves the point that this is what they generally were used for, as musical instruments. But the most enigmatic objects in the Dowris hoard, and the most common, are these strange objects called by archaeologists at the time cruttles. They invented a name for it. There's one bunch of them. There's a different bunch. 48 of these things are found. And the second, I think, most enigmatic thing about the cruttles is that they are only known from the Dowris hoard. 48 of them, except for one isolated one elsewhere. Never turned up in any of the other Bronze Age hoards. Incidentally, in the late Bronze Age, well, middle to late Bronze Age, the number of hoards of objects found of all sorts, gold, bronze, etc., is 230. Okay? 200, of which 130 come from this phase of the late Bronze Age. The Dowris hoard is dated somewhere between 900 to 600 BC, so in the late Bronze Age. And almost all of these cuttles occur in the Dowris hoard. But what are they? Among archaeologists at the time, much debate, were they bells, sheep bells or something. This idea coming from the fact that they are not hollow. They contain little metal key-like objects which rattle. Yeah? They have a kind of rattling effect. Simon O'Dwyer, the musician man I mentioned a moment ago, he thinks that they are musical rattles and uses things like that in his own compositions now. Yeah? So they may or may not be, but looking at them and hearing the story is one thing about them, but there is something extraordinary in actually taking one of these things into your hand.
Wow.
And it's remarkable to think that the last time somebody held this in their hand and knew what to do with it was nearly 3,000 years ago. Now, I can't let it out of my sight, but at the end, you may, if you wish. It's like, I mean, to me, it's borrowed from the museum, by the way. It really is what we used to call a relic. Remember, we used to call a relic, where you touch something that actually came from the past or belonged to some venerated, and it kind of puts you in touch with it. This really does that, because it's only when you're holding that you realize the sophistication of the people who made an object which is so distinctive and so different. How could it have been forgotten?
John, were there not similar things found in Manure, in the bull cult?
Well, they're not quite, but they are Latin. They are similar to it. The bull cult brings up another suggestion because of the resemblance of the horns to cow's horns. One suggestion from archaeologists even today is that maybe they are connected with some kind of a bull cult. But I think the important point about what the suggestion you're making is that there may well be a connection somewhere, in some aspect of this story, with much earlier civilizations, such as the Minoan civilization. But we'll come back and look briefly at that little later on. Anyway, so they're the cruttles, and other things as well. Small, less dramatic things like punches and gouges and chisels, etc., which are woodworking tools. As are the socketed axe heads. In other words, suggest that a lot of these objects were for wood, to do with woodworking timber, cutting down trees, carpentry, etc., etc. So by 1848, and everybody knew that the Dowris hoard had become famous. To such an extent that antiquaries were visiting Quigsborough, talking to people, etc., and a map was even published, which is now in the Royal Irish Academy, purporting to show, if you can read it there, you see that? What that said, here the Dowris hoard was found, and that's all that left was remained of Lough Boora. At the time. This is the end of the 19th century. So the antiquaries went along and spoke to the locals. But if you remember what Dr. Anderson had said 40 years before, that hasn't changed. It is most unlikely, in my view, that anybody would have told them. Where certainly not the one man who was alive at the time that the Dowris hoard was found. The suspicion, at least a suspicion, that they weren't going to tell anybody. So it could be anywhere still here. There it is on the modern map. This is the 1838 map again. There's Dernock House in their factories just up here. This is approximately where, somewhere here, and I put in red in here because I'm going to talk about it in a little more detail shortly. There's an extraordinary esker ridge running southwards from the broad general area of Lough Boora. So that's the story. That's what we know. Most of the Dowris hoard today is in the National Museum. Thomas Lawler Cook, towards the end of the 19th century, he sold his half to the British Museum, which eventually came back to Dublin. Generously enough on their part, they sold it back to Dublin. So that's back in Dublin now. And Lord Ross's half of it was given into the safekeeping of the National Museum in the 1920s. And in the 1960s, so quite recently, the National Museum bought that half of it. So the Dowris hoard is now, what we know of it survives is in the National Museum. And that's all, that's the story. And you might say, well, is there anything else we can add to it? Are there any other avenues of investigation, particularly given the way in which access to the truth, to a large extent, the historical is maybe blocked off? Well, I would suggest that there are two. This is that map I showed you earlier. Remember, there's Lough Boora, and I drew attention to the 4 lakelets. Okay, there's a little chaplet of lakes there. 1, 2, 3, 4, and that map has decided to spontaneously turn on its side for some reason. But in any case, the 4 little lakes I'm talking about are, I can't see them now. On the side, there's somewhere down there. It's gone off the map. It doesn't matter. But
they're up the top, John. The arrows in the wrong place. You see, it says Five Valley on the side, on its side, and then to the right.
Yeah. It's 4 small little lakelets, which have been the subject, interestingly, of at least 2 paintings of Mike Bulfin's. Mike Bulfin's family comes from just beside Lough Boora, basically. And he has found this little chaplet of lakes particularly fascinating, especially because of the way in which they're over against the vast extent of bog that extends northwards. And this is Black Lough. The most northeasterly one of them is the Black Lough. And this is the only picture I managed to dig up over, after years of searching, of Alison Healy. Here she is. Alison Healy, 30 years ago, Alison Healy did her PhD, her doctorate, on the pollinology of Black Lough. In other words, she studied the pollen record of Black Lough in great detail over a period of 3 years. Now, the significance of this, of course, is that Black Lough is beside Lough Boora. And her findings enable us to paint in enormous detail what it was like at the time, what the vegetation was like at the time the Dowris hoard was deposited, at the time the Dowris farmers were in the area. Now, we'll go into it in detail. This is one of her pollen diagrams. For those of you not used to pollen diagrams, basically they coloured all the different, they represent different species of plants found at increasing depth in the peat. So as you go further back in time, so, years before the present, 1,000, 2,000, etc., right back to the end of the Ice Age. Right back to the end of the Ice Age, we can see, by running across horizontally here, what the vegetation at any particular time was like. It enables us to reconstruct vegetation history in great detail. And the timeline of the Dowris hoard is here. See that line there? Running across here. And you trace that across, you will see that for that period of, maybe 500 years, of several hundred years, there's a great, this green here, that is tree cover in general. Yeah? So there's a great reduction in tree cover, which is accompanied by an increase in herbaceous pollen. In other words, the kind of plants that grow in grassland or on arable land. So what you're seeing reflected here is a very intense period of agriculture, a very successful period of agriculture that we can describe in huge detail from the pollen record. Now, this is only a part of the pollen chronicle for the time, showing you the principal one. You see, in the pollen record, the main plants represented are those which have pollen that's dispersed by wind, in other predominantly trees. Whereas all the hundreds of plants which are pollinated by insects are most unlikely to find their way into the pollinate. But if you look carefully enough, as she did over her 3 years, things like, for example, primroses, cowslips, dandelions, do turn up, but it might be only 5 grains, out of thousands, etc., because of the fact that their pollen isn't carried by the wind. But the fact that she studied it so very carefully means that we're able to pick out these less common plants in order to attempt, if we wanted to paint a detailed account of what the landscape and the farming was like at the time of the deposition of the Dowris hoard. And our general conclusion is that it was very successful, very productive, etc. But it succeeded as the Bronze Age came to an end, maybe about 200 BC, as the Bronze Age came to an end, at the beginning of the Iron Age, when the climate deteriorated sharply, big drop in temperatures, etc., and farming became far less intensive, and the woodland quickly recovered and replaced it to a large extent, particularly in what was becoming an increasingly wet landscape. You look, for example, at the occurrence of alder, which is a plant in wet places, bog edges, rivers, etc. You can see that it really only begins to take over at the end, towards the end and after this particular period. There's that more closely. There's the place we're talking about here. The distribution of hazel apparently is particularly significant because once farming is abandoned or becomes less intensive, hazel is one of the first things that will come and take over the arable or pastoral fields. So, Alison's her work, that sheds a lot of new light on what the landscape was like. It gives credence to the fact that this was obviously a prosperous time, as prosperous times were in those days. But we still haven't answered the question of why here? I mean, how does this extraordinary assemblage of objects come to end up in the middle of nowhere, essentially? It's not near any trade routes. It's not an obvious place, for example, for anybody to be manufacturing two extraordinary things, especially since they're isolated. There's no other evidence at all of any connection with the object. One hypothesis of the archaeologists is that maybe this is a hoard of objects of a metal, for craft work in metal, either hidden or lost or whatever it is. And as evidence for that, one archaeologist points out that among the many lesser objects found in the Dowris hoard, there were a number of small lumps of bronze. And maybe that these little bits of bronze, tiny little bits of lumps, basically, maybe they're bits of melted bronze that the craftsmen had put aside, etc. There's one explanation. Of course, another explanation is that the lads back in the 1820s had been experimenting with melting down some of the bronze objects to see, could anything more valuable be got from them, and found that they weren't getting much success with it. So that, there are difficulties with that hypothesis. The more widely accepted hypothesis is that they are ritual deposits. They're what they call votive offerings, because so many other of the hoards deposited during the late Bronze Age have a lot of evidence in that context, especially as objects deposited in lakes, in water. Maybe there was something about the religious beliefs or whatever we want to call it of these people that made certain places sacred in their belief system or their religion. So if we accept that for the moment, that there had to be something special, something unique about this particular place, what could it possibly be? This is an artist's attempt at reconstruction, something about which we know nothing of the detail. So let's look at that. Why here? What's so special about this place? Okay, there we are back again. There's Lough Boora again. There's the chaplet of little lakes with Black Lough here at the eastern end. Now, if we could take a drone's eye view of this landscape, it doesn't show. It doesn't show up properly on map. You can't represent it adequately on maps. Boora is just here to give you a sense. And this is a map showing the distribution in the South Midlands of the esker system, the main lines of the esker system, which are these the red lines here. There's the Shannon, Lough Owel up there, etc. So that's the main run of them, at a very small scale. But I started to mention, if you look in more detail, there's Lough Owel again, and this is part of a field sheet from the Geological Survey workers in the 1860s. In the 1860s, the Geological Survey were using the first edition of the 6-inch map. They combed the country foot by foot, recording all the geology and other making observations on landscape character, etc., etc. And I mentioned here, here's this extraordinary ridge that begins here and then runs southwestward, particularly. Really almost artificial looking. There the lakes again, by the way. Not shown terribly clearly there. 1, 2, 3, and the other one, Black Lough over here. If we follow that map further south, you can see the way at higher resolution, this is the 6-inch map, at higher resolution, it expands into, and I think it's safe to say, a unique landscape, which is best described in terms such as that. Billowing, anastomosing series of wave-like ridges and pinnacles that are quite extraordinary. So you have the ridge above Lough Boora, then you have this extraordinary anastomosing series, and then it runs back into, there's a single ridge again, almost artificial looking. There's that little bit enlarged with the commentary made by the Geological Survey. Talks about the remarkable assemblage resembling a little mountain cluster, etc. Very steep in many cases. Very, very steep and very, very strange geologically. Here's a little comment in the hand of the Geological Survey. He says, the peak here, and he's pointing to this little area here, called Scarnabinia, which is a name that doesn't occur anywhere else. It's not recorded in the Ordnance Survey name books, for example. So he obviously picked it up talking to local people. But it's significant in terms of its meaning, because Scarnabinia is clearly Esker Nabinia, the esker of the peaks. It's not referring just to one peak. Binia is plural. This esker is the esker of the peaks, which describes it aptly, because you've got so many of these extraordinary assemblages. There is Scarnabinia. As I said, it's impossible to really give an impression of how it strikes even a geologist like myself. You know, that it is just so different. There's nothing else quite like it. I tried to take some pictures from the top of Scarnabinia, but it doesn't do anything. There's that part of the ridge running south, etc. Really steep-sided with absolutely remarkable views in all directions, and linked up to all sorts of other ridges and hills and pinnacles, etc., etc. As I say, puzzling even to the eye of a modern geologist, and impossible to represent on a map. impossible to give you any sense of the extraordinary complexity of it on the map. Even though, as you can see, the geological surveyor attempted to, represent it in a rough kind of way in his sketch there. There's really only one way to do this properly, to give an accurate impression of how extraordinary this landscape is, and that is by using the modern technique of LiDAR. LiDAR is a particular type of imaging system that shows you the landscape in the most extraordinary detail. To give you an example, we don't have it for the area we're interested in at the moment, but this is a LiDAR image for part of the area north of Boogh. LiDAR. And there it is with the area photography superimposed on it. And you'll see the way in which this is the Boogh Castle Estate woodland. LiDAR can penetrate vegetation up to a certain extent, enabling us to see in unparalleled, unprecedented detail exactly what the pattern of ridges, in other words, what the topography is on a very minute scale. So what we are now about to attempt, with funding, thankfully, from Offaly County Council Heritage Office, is to get LiDAR for the Lough Boora area in order to see, first of all, what does it look like? What exactly is it that these Bronze Age people were responding to, if that hypothesis is correct? What is it about them that was so special or different or attractive to them? And having asked that question, what is it in actual fact? We hope to be able to work out what the geological processes at work informing this peculiar landscape from a geological point of view. That's if you like, the more purely scientific bit of it. But we have a second aim. This is something that some of you may know that a couple of years ago, Alison Ross and myself, we did an atlas of Boogh. Well, this is an attempt to go a little bit further looking at the nature of the landscape to see, can we go a little bit deeper? And in relation to this second part of the question of something where there may be more to be found, I'll read a page from a draft of this new work, looking again at the nature of the landscape from the point of view of the Dowris landscape. I mentioned that the billowy wave-like fall. Our starting point, in the sense of taking a phrase that Seamus Heaney, I remember Seamus Heaney at a conference a couple of decades before he died, using a remarkable phrase where he said that geology and poetry are twin ways of responding to the mystery and making of the world. Twin ways. So sometimes when I'm out in this area quite often, and sometimes when I walk these fields, I try to step outside all the prejudices of my scientific perspective. Prejudices. And impossible though this is, I try to imagine how my Bronze Age avatar might see this landscape. Remember, these are smart people. Look at what they're capable of achieving in bronze work, for example. And remember the connections that they have with other cultures on the European mainland. They may not have the internet, but nevertheless they are in deep, slow contact with other cultures and their traditions and achievements. So how might they see it? And what I wonder is if in their story of the making of this world, this landscape might be imagined with its enormous green waves as a frozen remnant turned to earth of the primeval world, of the beginning of things, where the divinity behind the shaping of the world might still be within earshot of our shouts or prayers. And maybe that's another line of inquiry, or at least room for another line of inquiry, parallel to our topographical one, because we're looking at the topography and trying to understand the geology of it. Yeah? But another line of inquiry that would mine the depths of the world's great deposit of myth, for echoes of this way of imagining or seeing the world, in the process taking us a little bit closer to what the Dowris hoard really is all about than any other avenue of inquiry might do. You see, in the creation myths familiar to us, in the creation myth, for example, preserved in our own Christian biblical tradition, summarized in the book of Genesis, remember, what dominates the chaos before creation was the untamed ocean, over which the Spirit of God, we are told, brooded, as perhaps a Bronze Age deity brooded over the waters of their primeval ocean. They might think this has little relevance to the challenges of our lives. But the more I think about this, the more I think that perhaps it does have a certain relevance, because our world is changing, as perhaps theirs was. Remember? You're coming into the Iron Age lull. The climate is getting worse, it's changing, etc. Farming is no longer profitable. Our world is changing, as perhaps theirs was. But today the change has a global horizon. Not one encompassed by the sun's rising in the morning and going down in the evening, but a profound difference between our world and the world of Dowris is the fact that we need not cry or pray for help to defeat the descent into chaos that faces us, because we know what we need to do to stop it. And what is at question is not whether a deity can still hear us or is able to or willing to come to our aid, which is how our Bronze Age ancestors must have thought. The question is whether we will act. Because if we don't, we may find ourselves as powerless as they when their chants and prayers fell on deaf ears. And on that ominous note, I thank you.